Good morning. This is the Board of County Commissioners Board Work Session. It is Monday, October 30th, 2023. It is 9:03 a.m. This session is set to go until 11 a.m. This is a hybrid meeting. We're at 3000 Pacific Avenue Southeast, room 110. For public virtual attendance, you may follow along on the Thurston County YouTube channel. I'm Carolina Mejia. I'm the chair of the board. Vice Chair Tiedemanns are in the boardroom. Commissioner Kerry Edwards joining us via Zoom, and he'll be in the boardroom shortly. And interim county manager Robin Campbell joining us, as well as assistant county manager Rob Gilder.
Yes.
And today we will be discussing the Shoreline Master Plan update briefing. And this is the 7th session we're having. And so some decisions are requested for today. And can we turn on the camera in the boardroom, please?
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Oh, I saw Commissioner Messer. Were you saying hi, or did you raise your hand, sir?
Just saying hi. No.
Okay, thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I'm making my now customary morning announcement regarding technology issues in the boardroom. We continue to have challenges with streaming. We are doing the best we can. The equipment should be replaced by the end of this week. The part is on its way. In the meantime, we are recording our meetings and we will post them no later than the following day. So if you're having trouble following along with the live YouTube, then look for the meeting to be posted tomorrow. And that is it for me. So we'll start. Yes, thank you. As you stated, Commissioner, we are here this morning for continuing conversations on the Shoreline Master Plan. And Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you. As Chair Mejia mentioned, we are on our 7th briefing. We made a lot of progress during the last briefing, so thank you, Commissioners. We are returning today with 16 remaining decision points from the matrix, which you should have in your packet, as well as, I think it's just one other item up for discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy. We do have a presentation to go through. We've tried to batch things so that we move through these as expeditiously as possible, but as always, if you have questions or we need to spend more time on it,
great, thank you. Go ahead and launch the presentation. Okay. Good morning, Commissioners and County Managers. Andrew Jones with Thurston County Community Planning. So today, I'll give a brief project background, provide some context for the board and for anyone who is watching the briefing, and then we'll continue exploring specific items from the public hearing and items the commissioners have requested to cover. So Thurston County is updating its Shoreline Master Program as required by state law. The project includes both comprehensive and periodic updates to state requirements since the current SMP was adopted in 1990. The SMP regulates development and redevelopment in the county's shoreline areas, which generally includes Puget Sound, large streams and lakes, and associated critical areas such as wetlands and floodplains. The board held a public hearing on the proposed update on May 16th of this year. It has been holding regular work sessions since that time to refine the documents ahead of considering them for local adoption. Ultimately, the locally adopted SMP is submitted to the State Department of Ecology for review. Typically, Ecology will work with county staff and eventually return a conditional approval to the county. The SMP update will take effect upon formal approval by Ecology and final action by the Board of County Commissioners. So the Planning Commission Shoreline Master Program recommendation was provided to the board back in February, along with a decision matrix of additional items the board could consider for that draft. These items came from Ecology staff's review of the Planning Commission recommendation and county staff's subsequent work sessions with Ecology. And generally speaking, these are items that increase consistency with state law, aid implementation of the SMP, increase clarity, reduce duplication, increase landowner flexibility, or enhance shoreline protections. That decision matrix had three big categories. One was major decision points or big themes that had been present during Planning Commission review and that the board wanted to weigh in on. Ecology indicated require items, which were things that were likely to come back as required changes if the board did not make those changes. And ecology indicated helpful items, which were things that may or may not have risen to the level of a required change, but would improve the protections offered by the SMP or aid implementation of the SMP. So the board directed staff to include all those items in the public hearing draft in order to receive public feedback and has been reviewing those items in recent briefings. At the last briefing, the board approved several items in that matrix, which included changes made to the public hearing draft that didn't get specific public comment, and then some other items as well. So today we'll take a look at the 16 remaining items in the board's decision matrix and see which ones the board's ready to make a final decision on. Some of them are pretty minor, but I just wanted to call out the origin of that matrix was to really showcase all of the potential changes to that draft for full transparency for the public and for the board's review, big or small. And then we're looking at things that have already been changed, so the question really is the board ready to accept the draft as it has been presented, or is additional change warranted? So we've batched them as Ashley mentioned, so I will tee up, the goal here is to tee up about 4 at a time and then pause and see if there are comments or questions from the board before moving on to the next set. So items 6 and 16 were grouped together. Item 6 is references to critical areas within the Shoreline Master Program, and item 16 is addressing critical areas in shoreline jurisdiction. Item 6 had to do with how the draft represented how critical area standards were being incorporated into the SMP. Earlier drafts had implied that the critical areas ordinance itself was being adopted into the SMP, which is not technically correct. The critical area standards, i.e. the information from the document versus the ordinance itself, is what's actually being incorporated into the SMP. And the changes that were made to the public hearing draft clarify that fact. We got 2 comments on that piece. One, I believe, was advocating for including the critical area standards in the body of the document versus as an appendix. The other suggested that there be a change to one section of the SMP to clarify that shorelines themselves are not critical areas unless they are so defined by the Growth Management Act. So item 16, which is related, introduced text corrections to the explanation of when critical area standards would apply versus the previous item was how they're being brought in. This is in the section of the document that lays out what critical areas are subject to shoreline jurisdiction and discusses when the main SMP rules apply versus scenarios where both the main SMP rules and the critical area standards would apply. The previous draft did not make that clear. So we got 2 comments on this one as well. One that supported the change that was made for the public hearing draft, and another that stated that the Shoreline Master Program should protect critical areas consistent with the Growth Management Act. So item number 7 was allowing bulkheads in eutrophic lakes to prevent erosion. This had to do with changes that were made to the structural stabilization allowances in the public hearing draft. The Planning Commission recommendation had a provision that would authorize structural stabilization on eutrophic lakes for the purpose of preventing that sediment getting in. A eutrophic lake is a shallow lake with a soft, mucky bottom. We've got a lot of those in Thurston County. Eutrophication is a natural process that over time sees these open water lakes convert into shallow vegetated wetlands. So the allowance from the Planning Commission recommendation was in direct contrast with the requirements of state law, which specifically lay out that there are very limited instances in which you can authorize hard structural stabilization in a master program. So that allowance was removed from the board's public hearing draft. I do want to point out that if there's an eroding lake shoreline that is a near-term threat to a primary structure or a house or something like that, that structural stabilization may be authorized. And if it's not a near-term, softer measures can potentially be authorized depending on the purpose or on the situation. We received 2 public comments on this that both supported the Planning Commission's previous recommendation. So item 12.
I have a question.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Madam Chair,
Go ahead, sir.
so you're saying that item 7, although recommended to allow a hardened bulkhead, I guess is the even though it was recommended to have that, you're saying it was taken out because ecology won't allow it? Or isn't there some situations where it is allowed, it sounded like?
Yeah, so the issue is, it was basically saying you can have a bulkhead if you have a eutrophic lake. So kind of a carte blanche, allow these bulkheads in these areas, which is inconsistent to the WAC. The language, the section of the SMP that was altered in the Planning Commission recommendation to include that, it kind of tacked that on to language that came verbatim from the WAC. And ecology has said that's inconsistent. The WACs are very prescriptive when it comes to shoreline stabilization. It's some of the most prescriptive language in the entire act. Thou shalt authorize stabilization in these following instances, and that one was not one of them.
And what is the process today?
Today, people can apply for stabilization. I believe we also require that sequencing, so you look at the softer approach would work for the intended purpose, and if a geotech report says it won't work and you actually need a bulkhead to protect a structure, then you can have it authorized.
But once we would pass this, that would no longer be a possibility?
That's still the case. So it is still the case. It's all need-based. So if you have a lake and you have a house on the lake and the bluff is eroding to the point where that structure is actually threatened in the near term, that is a situation where you authorize stabilization. I think the Planning Commission draft was saying is it's not an immediate threat. You still want the ability to put bulkheads on the lakes, and that was what was consistent with the WAC. So a true demonstrated threat to existing primary structures, that's where we're going to be authorizing that type of thing.
Primary structure is the key. I mean, it apply to a existing bulkhead. If we had an existing bulkhead, are they allowed to repair that existing bulkhead?
Yes, draft allows for, proposed SMP allows for repairs to bulkheads, and it provides for replacing those as well. They still go through that demonstration need, and if this is something that's less impactful to the environment, that's going to accomplish the same purpose, that's what they're going to, that's where we're going to point them. But if a bulkhead is what's needed and that's what's demonstrated to be needed, then the draft does allow for that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and move on to item 12, which is referencing the WAC substantial development permit exemption criteria in our existing structures regulations. This is a very minor one, if I may say so. It pertains to the Shoreline Master Program section that discusses when alteration to an existing home is exempt from a substantial development permit. The change that was made prior to the board's public hearing basically inserts a reference to the state exemption criteria. We are required to use those criteria, so it's appropriate to point out to that. We got one public comment which supported the change that was made for the public hearing draft. And the last one on this slide is item number 14, which is locating structures on constrained lots to prevent the need for shoreline stabilization. So this has to do with language that requires that structures that are being placed on a constrained lot, which is a lot that where you can't really meet the buffer standard because of one reason or another, there's another critical area or the lot is irregular shape, that if you're building on one of those lots, you have to locate in a manner that avoids the need for structural stabilization for the life of that structure. The Planning Commission recommendation used the word minimize versus avoid. Ecology has pointed out that trying to avoid these structural stabilizations is more consistent with the WAC. It goes back to that whole mitigation sequencing. You seek to avoid the impact and then minimize what you can avoid and finally mitigate for any impact that you're having. We got one public comment on this piece, which supported the change that was made for the board public hearing draft. So I kind of want to pause there. We've got 4 of these teed up and see if the board has any questions, thoughts, direction on whether to move forward with the draft as amended for the public hearing or if there's further discussion needed.
Comments, questions on any of these items?
I have a question on the critical areas pieces. It sounded like from what you were describing that it's maybe more of just how it's like a drafting sort of question in sense of, incorporated by reference or put in there, or where it's put in? I mean, like the actual substantive rules wouldn't really be different, but it's just a matter of how the plan is written. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct. And that comment about putting standards in the body versus the appendix is not really related to either of those items from the matrix. And again, I'm interpreting, I believe that's what that comment was intending. But yeah, no, these had to do with, there were portions of the draft that had said, you know, refer to the critical areas ordinance as included in Appendix E. Well, it's not the ordinance itself. It is critical area standards from that ordinance. It's a nuance, but it is, you know, the SMP is the actual regulatory piece that has these other standards. And we didn't want the confusion that there's still two ordinances that apply.
So this change that was made is a good change from your perspective?
It's a good change to actually clarify how the folding of critical area standards works in the shoreline world.
Yeah, and I think the intention there is that, you know, now folks have to get two permits under two
Yeah.
separate ordinances, and we wanted to make sure that there was no confusion moving forward, that it's a one permit that you're getting under the shoreline master program.
And then the other piece, comment 16, or item 16, was making it abundantly clear in the document exactly when those critical area standards apply, because it's confusing. Today you have marine bluffs that are both critical areas and shorelines. Well, you know, those areas are, unless there's actually a steep slope hazard, they're solely going to be regulated by the SMA versus critical areas and GMA. The shorelines are kind of supplanting those critical area rules in certain instances, and the draft was making it clear when that happens. And that's intended for the public and for our planning staff as well, and to just have it in writing, you know, if there's future interpretation questions.
So that's how it was, but this is just helping like the public understand that they're not going to be subject to two different sets of rules that are going to potentially conflict or whatever.
Yep, yeah, because there was a decision made years ago, back before I was on this project, to go ahead and bring those critical areas in. So that kind of ship had kind of sailed, and now we're just making sure it's clear what the rules of the road are.
Okay, so I'm good with the questions, but I guess just because it sounds like we're going to kind of go 4 by 4
Case by-
kind of.
yeah.
So just so I understand what we're approving or, you know, agreeing with. So the first box would be yes to the changes that had been made to the draft. Would a thumbs up on each box be the amended draft?
Yes, so
Okay.
what
That
we're
Ecology
explaining
had
here-
basically recommended or suggested?
Yeah, collaboration with staff, everything that you're seeing here, if the board, anything the board thumbs ups, I don't need to really make changes. That change has been made. You're just now
Okay.
verifying, through the lens of public comment, you're verifying if you want to keep those.
But what's confusing to me is on item 7, it says bulkhead allowances changed. Okay, so the draft is not the bulkhead allowances, because those were in the previous draft, and
Yeah.
then.
It was changed for your draft.
Okay, and then, so we're really sticking with the status quo on that kind of, sounded like what you were saying, in terms of how, because right now the WAC would apply.
The board's public hearing draft is now consistent with the WAC.
Planning Commission tried to amend the WAC, Ecology said, that's inconsistent with what's already in the WAC, so we'd basically be going back to the status quo in a sense.
Yeah.
Because the WAC applies now.
Mhm.
Okay, and then 12, permit exempt, I'm sorry, what was this one again? I've already forgotten.
This one was, how do we reference what is actually exempt from a
Oh, this is the one you
substantial
said was
development
really
criteria?
minor.
It's pretty minor. We literally inserted a reference to the WAC because we are required to follow those rules, so it made sense to reference those rules.
And then the last one, just to hit that one, characterization of stabilization changed.
Yeah, so the draft used to say, you know, if you have a constrained lot and you need
Oh,
to,
right, the constrained lot.
if you need to encroach on the buffer to locate a
The
new
avoid
structure,
versus minimize.
avoid the need for stabilization versus minimize the need for stabilization.
Okay,
And-
I'm good. Those are my questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, thank you for kind of reviewing those again, because that was gonna be kind of like my question, like the decision points on each one. So kind of hearing that walkthrough, are we ready to move forward with a decision, or are there still questions or comments?
I'm good, Madam Chair.
What,
Okay.
I do have one question, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, sir.
So what happens if we were to agree with the planning commission on 7, for an example? So, ecology is saying that doesn't meet the current WAC. Is there some legal challenge at that point, or they just don't authorize the new changes? What takes place?
So with any of these items, again, these are what ecology has kind of telegraphed in their informal review, what we're likely to hear at the formal stage. So if this item were changed back to the planning commission draft and that allowance was put back in, I think it's very likely that when ecology does its formal review, they're going to say, this is a required change, you need to change this before we will accept your document. But again, I can't promise that's what they will do. It's just that is our best indication of what would happen with that particular item.
So whether we agree with or not, they kind of jam it down everybody's throat regardless? Is that kind of the end result?
If that's, they have the ability to withhold approval on any items that are inconsistent with state law. So whether that, if that's the only thing they took issue with, whether they would hold that up, I can't say.
And state law includes WACs, which are created by an agency rather than the legislature.
I believe so. Yeah, the Shoreline Management Act is 9058 RCW. It directed ecology to produce the guidelines that all the jurisdictions have to follow.
So I disagree with the state on this issue, and my vote would be no, I want to go with the planning commission. But I might get overruled by my seatmates or outvoted by my seatmates, for an example. But then the process continues to go on, and we just keep moving forward. Even though I might disagree, that's the democratic process, is it?
That's, yeah, we're basically finishing out the matrix, which has been updated to show that that's already been happening. You have gone through several of those items and had that conversation last time of, okay, this one's 3-0, this one's 2-1, whatever the case is. That's what we're trying to.
And if I was a dissident on enough items that I felt, strongly, my time to express that might be here with a thumbs down versus a thumbs up. But during the final vote on the final proposal, and then that becomes the democratic process again.
Correct. Yeah, we are intending, in the spirit of attempting to move one more item off the board's plate by the end of the year, we're hoping to come back for that final decision on December 12th, I think is what we're aiming for. And so you have that opportunity now to shape what that document looks like, and then the whole board will have a final vote as well at the end.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Are we ready to make a decision on these items? Commissioner Munster, you said you were ready. Commissioner Edwards, are you ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Let's do a vote. Do you want to go item by item, or do you want to do it as a pack?
Item by item, let's do that.
Okay.
Tracking the others that way. Yeah. Okay, so number 6. 6 and 16, which were related to the how the critical areas are referenced in the draft.
I vote to retain the draft on each item, so you can go one by one if you want.
I think for our record keeping, it might be
6 to 16, so let's just go thumbs up if it means retaining the draft, and thumbs down if it means going back to the previous iteration. So I'm thumbs up.
thumbs up. Commissioner Edwards, do you have a thumbs up or down on 6 and 16?
On 6 and 16.
Okay. And how about item number 7, the bulkhead allowances on eutrophic lakes? Thumbs up?
Thumbs down.
Thumbs down?
Is your proposal to go back to the planning commission?
To accept the planning commission's recommendation regardless of what the WAC says.
Okay. I'll go with,
Thumbs up.
Yeah.
And item 12, which was referencing the WAC for substantial development permit exceptions. Thumbs up, 3, okay. And then item 14, which was how we characterize avoiding or versus minimizing shoreline stabilization for new structures on constrained lots.
what,
Oh, sorry.
probably should have asked this before. I understood it when you explained it and I was like, okay, that makes sense. But now as I'm looking at it, I'm like, well, what did it say beforehand? Has it always been?
And if it's helpful at any point, I can pull up the strike-through version of the draft. But so the Planning Commission's approved language said, new development on lots constrained by depth, topography, or critical areas shall be located to minimize to the extent feasible the need for shoreline stabilization. What ecology said was that's inconsistent with the WAC and recommended placing minimize, avoid. So essentially, that development on a constrained lot shall be located to avoid to the extent feasible the need for shoreline stabilization.
Madam Chair, can I comment on that?
Go ahead, sir.
My concern is that it eliminates any kind of flexibility through the terminology.
Well, it says to the extent feasible. So, if anyone were denied that use of that property, they can always apply for a shoreline variance. So it's never a flat-out prohibition. It's just, we're trying to avoid the need for new structures that all out of the gate have to have a bulkhead or something like that. That's the only way that lot can get developed, and that applicant has the ability to apply for a variance and go through that process.
I don't see a substantive difference, because if you have to minimize and then you can avoid, that's minimizing to the extent feasible.
Right.
If that's 0, you have to do that.
Yeah.
It's just terminology.
You have to avoid before you get to minimize and mitigate.
Right, but minimizing could be 0, like 0 is minimizing. If there's an option to avoid, that's the ultimate minimization.
Right.
It just provides the same kind of pathway that we have already existent, where you first, if possible, minimize if you can't, and then mitigate to address the offset.
If ecology took the time to point this out, I don't think that it's worth having a wrinkle about it, because I don't think there's a substantive difference, frankly. To me.
Okay, 2-1. All right, so we will move on to our next batch. So we've got item number 15, monitoring requirements for mitigation projects. The matrix says advanced mitigation projects, but it should say mitigation. That's an error. The language question applies to all mitigation projects. So this has to do with project monitoring, when someone has to install mitigation because they got a buffer reduction and had to do some planting or something like that. The previous draft erroneously indicated that the monitoring that was required for those types of projects could end in as little as 2 years. It was clarified to be 5 years and only after all the other performance standards were met. I talked to Brad about this one, and that change is actually consistent with what we meant to say all along. That was an error on our part, and we've corrected that so that the intent is that the project that you install, if you install plantings or whatever the case may be, that it gets established and we monitor it for a long enough time to ensure that that is going to be successful, or help ensure it's going to be successful. In the previous draft, really the fix was an or versus an and was an issue there. So we did get one public comment on that piece, which was supporting the change that was made for the board's public hearing draft. So item number...
So
Oh,
the
sure.
change, Andrew, on that one, the change is the length of time from 2 to 5 years.
Yeah, it had said...
2 now.
It had said, well, no, so this is all in the draft. So I don't know what it is, I can't tell you what it is today, from the 1990 SMP, but the draft had said you can end your monitoring if you're successful after 2 consecutive monitoring periods, which could be as little as 2 years. But we clarified it to say that, you also, and it also had language in there about meeting all of the performance standards. And it said or versus and. So we're making it clear that both of those things are required. You have to meet all of those standards for a period of 2 consecutive periods. And there is a minimum of 5 years for that, which I think is pretty standard. You know, the critical areas ordinance.
10 years.
5 years is the minimum. Yeah. It could have been as little as 2 years, which is not.
2 periods. I thought 2 periods of 5 years would be 10.
No, so the monitoring period could be a year. It doesn't, so it doesn't make that a prescriptive piece because it's going to vary depending on the type of mitigation project, if it's planting or where you are. And so the actual monitoring and all those prescriptions are worked out on a case-by-case basis. This is just general language that says.
How is that implemented by the regular county? How would that be overseen? They go out and make on-site inspections. We create a whole new bureaucratic division that goes back to the original.
We will require the applicant to submit the reports. So when you're building a structure, you need to have mitigation. It's up to the applicant and the consultants to say, this is the mitigation that we propose to have net loss and meet the standards of the master program. The county then reviews and ultimately accepts that material, and then they're on the hook for whatever the monitor is that was prescribed in those reports. And so if they have, I don't know, whatever concerns they have, they would then have that person do the monitoring and return that to the county.
So the citizen has to pay more money for a government regulation, basically.
They have to,
Because they have to hire that done.
yeah, they need to comply with the terms of their permit, which would be to perform that monitoring.
And the way it is now is you don't have to do it quite to that extent.
I'd have to go back and look at what the current SMP requires, but I know in the critical areas ordinance, it's prescriptive as well and calls out those things. This is how you do these reports. This is when they're required. This is what they have to look like.
Everything I'm doing, I'm trying to get the government off the public's back. That's where I'm coming from. So this sounds like the government keeps their thumb on you for another period of time, including additional cost.
Sorry. Oh, I see. I mean, it's intended to ensure that the mitigation is actually successful and is meeting the requirements of the Shoreline Management Act, which is to have no net loss of ecological function. So if you plant a bunch of vegetation, you know, to account for impacts to the buffer, and then there's no requirement to monitor it, there's no follow-up, there's no anything, you know, there's no guarantee that that's actually going to be successful and balance out the impact occurred.
I think where streamlining comes in is that the critical areas ordinance already, we know that one covers monitoring, and the current shoreline master program requires monitoring. We just don't know the exact time period.
Yeah.
But right now, a lot of people are having to go through both, and they're having to meet the requirements of 2 different permits, whereas once the new shoreline master program gets adopted, it'll be 1. So that will make it easier for both us here at the county to track, as well as individuals, you know, in terms of what the requirements are.
But we're not going to designate the length of time, which leaves that up to discretion on staff or what?
So the applicant can propose a mitigation prescription, but it's up, you know, county staff are going to have to look at that and make sure that it meets the standards of the SMP. So what the draft says is you got to meet all your performance standards, and you have to do that over 2 consecutive periods. So on one project, maybe it can be annual. On another project, maybe you're only monitoring every 2 years or something like that. It's open-ended enough so that the actual requirements can be tailored to the project itself.
I guess I'm referring to specific cases where beaver, for an example, came and chewed down the required plantings. And then, so what? The citizen has to either lie, no, I can't lie about it because you've got to hire someone to say it's still there. I don't know, it can go on forever with rodents, for an example. And so I'm just looking for a definite time to get the government off the citizens' back.
So I think the draft says it uses 5 years as a default. If at 5 years, I think that's the minimum. And if you've met at year 4 and year 5, I think you're done at that point.
Except if something has went away,
Well,
then you have to start.
during that time, yeah, but if it happens in year 6, then we're not watching for that.
I want you to quit watching at year 1, I guess, is where I'm at. So, okay, just as long as we know.
Okay, so item 17, this is shoreline buffer reductions, general proposed changes to those reductions. This included changes that were made to the provisions for how and when shoreline buffers can be reduced. The previous draft was not very clear, and it was not written in a way that, it was written in a way that would have been kind of a challenge to implement. That's not necessarily on the planning commission, that's just a fact of how it kind of came out of the gate. So changes were made for the public hearing draft for the board to close gaps in implementation and make those provisions more consistent with state requirements. We got 2 public comments on that item, one that supported the planning commission recommendation and one that encouraged the board not to reduce the buffers below what we have today or to allow non-essential buffer reductions. And then item 20 was the characterization of the shoreline setback in the draft. So this relates to how the shoreline buffer setback is characterized in the SMP. The setback is the area between the structure and the buffer that's intended to reduce or prevent impacts to the shoreline buffer. And it's, as written, up to a 15-foot distance. The previous draft had stated that the setback is not required after construction has happened. And this was clarified in the board's public hearing draft to state that after construction, that area is intended to be used for future maintenance of the structure or alteration of that structure. It's your space to work on that structure without affecting the buffer, essentially. So it's for the staging of equipment or, maneuvering area for future work. And after construction, it can also be used for normal residential activities. So lawns, dog kennels, swing sets, all those sorts of things. One public comment was received on this item, supporting the planning commission recommendation. And then the last item on this slide is item 22, which is providing mitigation sequencing context for allowances of decks and platforms and shoreline buffers. This relates to how the draft approaches allowances for decks and viewing platforms inside the buffer. So generally you have a shoreline buffer, you're not supposed to touch it. The draft does make allowances for you to have impacts in the buffer. This is one of those. All new shoreline uses are required to do that mitigation sequencing as we've discussed. The draft allows for limited incursions into the buffer for a deck or a viewing platform, but it didn't have the language to indicate that if you're going to do that, it should be the smallest size necessary to accomplish that use, the minimum encroachment into the buffer for that use, and that language, those sort of sideboards for mitigation were added into the board's public hearing draft. The board got 2 comments on this item, one that supported the planning commission's recommendation, one that did not support minimizing the size of these structures at all in the buffer. So I'll pause there. Those are the next 4 items. Questions?
Does item 20, does that end up allowing the citizenry maybe to get away from having to go to the hearings examiner process?
No, well, I don't think so. This is essentially saying, it's talking about the area that's in between your shoreline buffer and where you actually put your building footprint and how we characterize that in the draft. The previous draft had said, once you're done constructing, you don't need that area. But that's not true. It's where you would want to be doing your staging for future construction on the house or alteration or things like that, so that you don't have an impact to the buffer in the future. So it's kind of a buffer for the buffer.
So you could install, I don't know, if you're going to put siding or something like that on the side of your building, you could have a piece of equipment parked there.
Right. That's exactly right.
That's on 20.
And also hearing even longer term uses as well, like the swing set. or
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, so it becomes part of what your living space is.
And 22 allows you to put a deck or
Within the buffer, it puts,
within the
yeah.
buffer, as long as it isn't a hindrance or
It
something.
specifies, what the draft now says is that if you're doing that, it's gotta be the smallest size necessary to support the use, and it's gotta encroach into the buffer as little as necessary. So you don't automatically get the biggest and the closest to the water.
And
It's-
who determines that? The staff, any person, the hearings examiner?
It'd be the permit reviewer, so the applicant's gonna make a proposal, and we're gonna evaluate that, and they're gonna tell us what the intended use is, and how they're designing it for that use, and we'll be evaluating that. There's not gonna be, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule or a standard, on that. It's gonna be unique to each individual situation, but if, you know, something smaller would work, or we think something smaller would work, and in conversations with the applicant, potentially, that's what would be authorized versus something larger, just because that's what's preferred.
And how would the disagreement be settled?
Through the back and forth in, between staff and the applicant, and then ultimately through either that being approved, or if it's denied, the applicant would be able to appeal that.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. The appeal goes where? How do they appeal that? To the Board of County Commissioners? Or?
I'd have to look at the draft and see exactly how those are authorized. I think those provisions are intended to be administrative, so I think the first appeal would go to the hearings examiner, I believe.
So if it's an administrative permit appeal, body is hearings examiner. If it's hearings examiner permit, then it's a county.
Yeah. Let's see if I can find
So that would be a lot of additional cost. There's not a process in there for, say, the director of the,
Well, the director would ultimately, I mean, so if you're an applicant and you're working with county staff and you're disagreeing with county staff, I mean, the director is always someone that can be consulted by the applicant or county staff. Ultimately, the director has the authority on whether it's going to be approved or denied. That authority is transferred typically to staff to carry out the permitting. But the director is certainly, I believe, if there's ever a sense where the staff are going to deny something like that, and I think, you know, consulting with the director would be appropriate.
Because, I mean, there's other permits that you have to go directly to the hearing examiner for, right? And it's thought of as a more flexible and potentially streamlined process when you can get approval from staff.
Yeah.
That's what's been argued to me in various other contexts, and you're saying this is one of those instances.
Yeah, and so what it says is, so if you're doing this, let's say you want a 150-foot deck that's inside the buffer, we can approve that.
150-foot deck, you did
Yeah,
say?
like a square foot
Oh,
deck,
okay.
yeah, sorry. 150 square feet, in the buffer on, you know, outside your front door, it would be, you have to do mitigation sequencing, as we know, you have to try to avoid and minimize, but then it's an administrative, shoreline development, substantial development permit. So the hearings examiner is not involved in the permitting of that. If someone applies and is denied by CPED, it would go to the hearings examiner at that point for appeal.
Is it perfectly clear to the citizens that are using this system, the appeal process that, you know, is it stated in black and white that, you know, staff will be discretionary regulating, I guess, and if you disagree, if it cannot be negotiated or something like that, this can be appealed to the director of the CPED entity or his designee or.
So whenever a permit is issued, the appeal options are always provided in that permit. And, you know, the written piece of paper you get. So in addition to what's already codified, I think it is hard to wade through code, but that permit that you would get in hand has the language. If you have any questions, here's the timeline for your appeal, specific to your project, how you would go about submitting that appeal. So that's sort of the added support we give to folks if they choose to appeal. We don't want them having to go through the code. that's too burdensome.
And there are, throughout the document, there are statements about when decisions take effect, permit decisions take effect, after any appeal periods have lapsed. I don't know that there's a blanket statement in here that says, any permit decision, any aggrieved person can appeal through the following methods. I don't think it's laid out so clearly in the document. But as Ashley mentioned, that's going to be in the individual permit. And that's potentially something that we can include as our educational materials that we are going to promulgate with the SMP, once it's fully
But you
cooked.
can't get the permit to see that verbiage until after
If
you're
it were
satisfied.
denied, the
Right.
denial would come with the appeal provisions. But we are going to be doing, like I said, some educational materials, a pamphlet. We got a grant from the state to work on that. And this could potentially be something that is included in that, because we want a full suite of education surrounding this document and help break it down for the public, because it is complex, and we want them to know what their options are in different arenas.
As we move forward with this, is it possible, because it's hard to get a total grasp on this, we work with it a little bit, this, you guys work with it a lot, that you could make just a basic statement that 13 makes it a little easier to do this, or is more restrictive, or is less restrictive? Is there any way that the general public, and really including the board, that could be, it doesn't, I'm not looking for something exact, I'm just trying to generalize. Okay, this makes it a little easier. Like Ashley said, you don't have to get 2 permits to do this one if we add this.
And oftentimes.
If we don't add it, you might have to get 3 now or something. It just seems like it is so complicated. Maybe that's just because we just
I mean,
hadn't retired or recovered yet. I don't know.
Commissioner, would that be for each one of these? Because I know the overall, this update of the SMP was really trying to provide some flexibility that doesn't exist in the current code. But would that be helpful on a line by line throughout the?
Well, to me, it would be, because I'm trying to always, I'm working for the citizen to make it a little easier to do business with the government. That's what I'm looking for. So if you say this will make it a little easier, that's, I'm for it. But if you say, well, this might add 6 months to your permit, or, or make it harder, and when I ask, well, by, harder, what do you mean? Well, it might stretch it out, it might cost more money. I mean, the one where you're talking about individually, that review period is extended from 1 year to 5 years, and then there's 2 of them, or whatever it is, and each time you have to submit a permit by a professional, well, that's gonna cost people money. And I'm trying to get away from that. We as a society have an honor system that we sign that we did our taxes correctly, or, we fixed a repair notice on a traffic infraction, or something like that. That's the honor system. We don't seem to have very much of an honor system here. And so I'm just trying to get closer to that. That's where I'm headed.
Even with our taxes, there's a risk of an audit.
Yes, and there's a risk of a fine and a lot of other things as there could be here as well. So, yeah.
Can I ask a question on item 17? I'm having just a little hard time, and so I'm wondering if there's maybe like a real life example that you can provide me so I can kind of just connect the dots in my head, because I'm just having a little bit of trouble understanding like what that item.
Sure. Navigate myself to the part of the draft that was changed. Okay, so that item, we were really trying to clarify when and how the shoreline buffer could be reduced. So let's say your buffer is 250 feet, but you're not going to be able to meet that. The draft provides for limited instances when you can reduce that buffer to site that development. And the changes to the draft are intended to clarify that. So, for example, there was a change made here that says the buffer shall be adhered to unless otherwise allowed as described below, and the words "in the limited circumstances" described below were added. So making it clear that it's a limited thing. We made it clear what the permit standards were, if it's a administrative variance, if it's a full variance, and really just making it clear that the buffer is intended to be reduced only in those situations where you have a lot that's physically constrained by the size or the shape, or you've got slopes, wetlands, some other natural feature to where you can't meet that. Like if you put 250 out, you're going to be smack in the middle of a wetland or something, and we know we can't do that either. So really tries to be prescriptive.
Did that change come from ecology though?
Yeah, ecology kind of worked through the draft and moved some things around and said this, if you did this would be more easy to implement, more consistent. I think also we didn't have specific standards in here for, so for our streams, for example, we didn't have a specific statement as to how those buffers, what the width would be if you reduced it, and if it went automatically to the width that were allowed in the other types of shorelines, we'd be talking about a huge reduction, and that's not consistent with the principles or surrounding buffers. Now I'm going to go back and if we keep the board larger buffers, I'm going to have to go back and fix some of this stuff, but that was an inconsistency at the time. And then, yeah, it just, it kind of had some requirements in one section and then said, oh, but you also have to meet the following year. And, you're done, and then there was another section of if you're in this SED, this applies. So those are the kinds of things that we tried to clear up so that if you're reading it now, it's very clear how and when, and yeah.
Andrew, does ecology ever make things easier for citizens?
They are on board with a lot of the flexibility that are introduced into this draft as compared to what's in the current SMP. So this new draft has a lot more flexibility if you're trying to build in your existing footprint or you want to add on or something like that to landward of your house. We county are promoting a lot more flexibility. Ecology is on board with those provisions. So that's one area.
You used just recently the 250-foot setback. I think that's hard to contemplate, 250 feet. Most of what we're dealing with is around lakes, for an example, and I think it's a 50-foot setback or something like that. Could you use an example that's closer to that, or maybe it's 100? I really don't know.
Yeah, it gets very nuanced and complicated because as written, if you're already at a 50-foot buffer, any sort of reduction to that buffer because you're already so close to a variance, like that's just what the draft requires.
How does the averaging work? I think maybe even recently, but at least in the past, if you're building on a lot you bought 40 years ago and everybody else is at 20 feet, say, just because many years ago there weren't restrictions. So somehow there was an averaging component that went along with this. Is that still in place? Are you getting rid of that completely so that you're going to tell this guy, oh, you got to be 50 feet. Doesn't matter that everybody else is 25 feet or whatever it is.
I think those things are going away in the update.
So how can we have some
as proposed
common sense or whatever? I mean, we don't want the septic down there, but for sure. So why wouldn't we make allowances like that? Everything else is down here, but everybody else's septic is up above too. I mean, to me, that's what we're trying to do, is protect water quality as much as we can, and put at least the drain field elsewhere as far as we can.
I think that's a conversation the board could certainly have if that's something you wanted to insert or make sure is in the document. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so right now, there's the averaging business that is possible. And you're saying, when we get done with this, the averaging ability is gonna be gone?
As written, and I don't, I'm trying to think of, I think when I stepped into this project, I don't think we had those provisions in here. We have some stuff for view protection, that's not there anymore. I'd have to go back and research that, but I would just say, or flat out, if the board wants to entertain having such standards in the draft, it's a conversation that you could have. I don't have the history, or I'm not recalling exactly.
I mean, again, it goes back to whether or not my seatmates agree with me. I'm trying to make it so it is, there's more common sense thrown into the mix, I guess. You're penalizing somebody for paying off a piece of property over the last 30 years or whatever. They didn't build on it. Everybody else built on it. Least restrictive process. And now we're forcing this latecomer, although he's been paying taxes all these years, getting ready to do this. He's stuck. So I'm trying to impose something in there that will give him some relief, or that person some relief.
I recommend, if we could, sort of give the items that have been identified for the board's consideration, and then, our ask of you is there anything additional that you want to come back with? And so allow Andy to do that research in terms of what we're currently allowed or what's been allowed historically or through the drafts. I don't think we're prepared right now to have that additional information, but we are
Does
prepared.
the content make sense?
I mean, if the board decided that was an additional item to the ones that are teed up for today, we do have other briefings that are on the calendar where we could bring back more information so you could have
How long are we scheduled for today?
Till 11.
to 11. And we've got 2 to 4 and then one additional item
I just have to add one. Yeah.
which is an important one that has been brought up previously, so.
Okay.
So, I mean, then thinking about what I'm proposing, I guess, I don't know where my seatmates are on it, but so I guess I would be opposed to item 17 because it doesn't include that.
As written.
Yeah. I'm asking that we put some common sense in there and allow citizens to have that option, because that's all.
So I think we hold on that decision and bring that back at a further time, I think is what Ashley is saying, and see if there are any of these other items that we can kick loose.
So we have 4 decision points over here. Let's start with item 15. Thumbs up or down.
So, okay, great. On that. So number 17 we'll skip for now. Number 20 was the character of that shoreline setback outside of the river.
Okay.
And then number 22 was the platform, the standards for deck and viewing platforms, and trying to ensure that we allow they are the minimum necessary. Okay, great. Thumbs up for anyone listening at home. Not sure what you're seeing on YouTube. I see the slides. I don't know if the people are. When you watch it back, sometimes it's our faces and sometimes it's the slides. So
Just for purposes, do we have a board's direction to come back at a future briefing with item 17? With the buffer?
You do from me, I don't know.
Didn't hear the other commissioners' input on that item.
Can we go back to it at the end of the presentation, right, and kind of see where we're at, what else is happening, and then bring the item in there, and then just kind of have that discussion on like what the next step is. If that's okay.
okay, great. Then, so looking at the next batch, we'll start with item 24, which is a waiver of public access requirements. So this had to do with how the draft allowed waivers from the public access requirements of the Shoreline Master Program. Generally, public access is a required element of larger projects such as, residential subdivisions, commercial and industrial uses, really anything that's going to increase the demand for public access on the shoreline, is going to interfere with an existing public access right away, for new non-water oriented things, the, like industry or something like that, that's require a public access component. The previous draft said that the county could waive that public access component if the cost of providing that access was disproportionate to the overall cost of the project. That's not really supported in the Shoreline Management Act that we can find. And one of the things the ecology came back and said was, you can potentially change this to be more consistent with the act. And the proposed solution was to allow a waiver of public access requirement if the cost of providing that access is disproportionate to the actual impact on public access. We got 2 public comments on that. Both of those were supporting the previous draft as it was written. So number 25.
Wait,
oh,
before
sure.
you leave 24.
Sure. Go ahead.
So right now, I'm just gonna guess, because I don't know for sure what you're referring to, but so somebody wants to make a small development on a lake. So I don't know what a small development, 10, gonna build 10 homes. But we don't wanna contaminate the lake any more than we have to. So would we have that requirement of public access open to the homeowners association public or the general tax-paying public? What are we talking about there?
The draft as written allows for that public access to be limited to the people who are,
Members of
yeah,
that
so if it's like
association.
HOA or if it's, I think,
Like the Green Cove example that we really
Exactly.
dug into for the environmental designation discussion, where it's really just open to residents in that particular
yeah,
neighborhood.
I'm trying to find the specific language, but this is something the planning commission talked about quite a bit. And I believe we did say that it can be limited to those folks. I may not be able to find it right now, but,
I mean, we have public accesses that the state owns, I guess.
oh, it does say, okay, so for residential development of 5 or more lots, public access may be limited to the owners of lots in the development and their guests. So,
So 5 or more.
because 4 or less, you're not required to provide any public access. That's the trigger is 5 or more. State law.
So pie-shaped piece of property, for an example, and you're gonna put 10 lot up here, but it goes down to the water. So this water area could be like community public access to the homeowners.
And the issue that we're talking about here is related to like when can you deviate from that requirement? What are the possibilities? So, and to your point, is something that makes it more complicated or less complicated. I would say that this one, this change in the draft is more of an onus on the developer because the planning commission recommendation said if the cost of doing that is disproportionate to the cost of your project, we can waive that. The change that was made says you can only waive that if the cost is disproportionate to the actual impact you're having on public access. You're not actually creating a lot of demand or you're not removing a lot of existing capacity and it's going to be super expensive to do that, well, that's when you can waive it. So that was the change that was made for the board's public hearing draft. So 25, oops, go ahead and keep teeing up here. So this is a minor one, I believe, with the permit table in the draft. Typically, we use abbreviations to indicate what type of permit is required. You probably see that in the zoning ordinance. The previous draft used the letter E in that table for projects that may be exempt from a substantial development permit. That really can be misleading because a project is only exempt if it actually meets all the criteria in the master program, which you can't really specify in one cell. For example, you could have a house that is exempt because it meets all the criteria versus someone who's going to be building something that doesn't meet those criteria. Both people are looking at the table, they think they're exempt, but only one of them is. So as written, it could lead to implementation challenges or situations where people think they're exempt and they don't need to follow the master program, but they really do. So the change was made on that table to indicate that in general, the projects may be exempt only if they meet the exemption criteria. So it's one of those things where it's true whether or not you actually say it. We've gone ahead and clarified the draft to indicate that.
Somebody didn't like that.
We got one comment which supported the planning commission recommendation, which did come from a former planning commissioner, so someone who's very well aware of these issues, and I know that was one of his particular issues.
Yeah, and the challenge there is that you don't want someone getting caught up in a code compliance, case just because they misread a table. So it really is to try to help folks, navigate all of the requirements.
Yeah, make it clear what's actually required. Okay, item 26, which is permit standards for dredge disposal. So the previous draft would have allowed for, if you're doing dredging, would have allowed for the disposal of that material in the natural shoreline environment designation. And there were also fewer permit standards for some of the other designations. Ecology pointed out that that's inconsistent with the purpose of establishing a natural SED, which is areas that are relatively pristine and you're hoping to manage them to remain that way, and allowing dredge disposal in that environment is counter to that purpose. They also advocated for greater oversight on dredge disposal in some of those other SEDs, so increasing the permit standards for some of those other areas. So permit standards were updated in the board's public hearing draft. Dredge disposal was proposed to be prohibited in the natural SED and allowed in the rural and urban conservancy areas with an administrative conditional use permit. We got one comment that supported the change that was made for the board public hearing draft.
Where does dredge disposal go now? What can you do now? I didn't even know you could dredge, but.
It's gonna be, again, when, in those limited instances where it's allowed, well, you can dredge existing navigation channels, for example. And, it could go to a landfill, it could go to a place where it's used for ecological restoration. I don't know
Why
exactly all
couldn't
the
it be
places,
used for
but
topsoil enhancement or
potentially
something like
it
that?
could. It's just, this is saying, when can you actually place it in the shoreline? If you're dredging here, you just wanna drop it versus having to haul it off somewhere.
Yeah, no, I didn't know that, like, a private resident could dredge, so I'm just kind of,
So dredging and
I thought
dredging
it
is,
had to be through, like,
State permit.
yeah, a state permit that you
Yeah.
went through.
it's an authorized use in some instances, and this is specifically saying, so if you are authorized under whichever county or state or federal permits you need, where can you dispose of that material?
Where I'm going with that is, many of our low-land lakes were sawmill ponds 100 and some years ago. And the spoils from the sawmills were just pushed out into that water body. It floated out some, whatever, and now there are citizens that would like to clean organic material out because it's 3, 4, 5 feet of muck. And I guess my question is, wouldn't we want to make that, I guess, easier for them to rectify a prior human-caused problem? Because it's degrading the lake, you might say. So how would that fit if they were to get, I suppose anywhere you do any dredging, you got to get some kind of a permit, I suppose. So you get that permit, and this is only so that you can put those spoils 100 feet from the shoreline, or something
Yeah,
like
it's
that. or
specifying when you could potentially dispose of that material or put it in the shoreline jurisdiction versus when you need to take it
what is
all
the shoreline jurisdiction, I guess?
Generally speaking, it's going to be 200 feet, but again, it's whatever the buffer is. So, but actually, well, it gets more complicated than that because technically it's all of 200 feet or beyond. So if your buffer is 50 feet, technically though, that 200 feet is my jurisdiction. So, to take it all the way out, it would be 200 feet out. But we're talking about the natural environment here, which in lakes, I believe it matches up with the 200 foot for marine lines and lake.
But this is an instance where we got feedback from ecology that we
Right.
with the wax.
Yeah, ecology was
So-
saying, the natural shoreline environment designation, the purpose is to keep that natural, not alter it, or impact it, so.
Not build it up
Or
behind the bulkhead, for
yeah,
an
so-
example.
So take it out of the natural environment is what they said. And then in the other ones, it was, allow it, but with a conditional use permit. That was their recommendation.
So why not allow it with conditional use permit? Are you saying this does that?
It does in the urban and rural conservancy. So the big issue was the natural. So, not going there.
Keeping the natural as
As
but allowing a path for the other.
So the
designations.
case I'm referring to, where it's filled up with muck over the last 100 and some years, that could be allowed to take that out, but it'd have to be deposited outside of that designated area, and I'm trying to figure out what that designated area is.
You would have to just go through the permit process. I think
Right.
each scenario is going to be really unique
Mhm.
and just approval, even what's on the books now and what's going to be on the books, there are multiple permits that you would need, an individual would need to get. What this change is just making sure that the new program is consistent with law in terms of where the deposits can happen in the natural designation.
The only comment we got was supportive.
Right, you got one comment that supported the change that was made for the board. Public hearing. Okay. So item 8, again, should be pretty minor. This has to do with some clarifying language that was part of the Shoreline Master Program draft back before the Planning Commission recommendation changed the labeling of legally existing non-conforming structures to conforming. So because that word non-conforming is controversial, the previous draft included a paragraph that basically said, this is what this word means, this is what it doesn't mean. That explanatory language was removed when the Planning Commission recommendation removed the word non-conforming. So it all went away. Now that the board has amended the draft, that we're saying some things are considered conforming, some things are going to be called non-conforming, consistent with state law. It may be helpful to put that explanatory language back in so that when people are reading it, see the word non-conforming.
Just for those folks who are in that legally required.
Exactly, yeah. So we did add it back into the board's hearing draft because the word non-conforming is back, and so we want to be able to contextualize that for people. And then, so you did get one public comment on that, which just was essentially wanting to revert back to the Planning Commission recommendation and use of the word conforming for all structures is how I interpreted that comment. So again, pretty minor, just related to how we contextualize a previous decision that has been settled by the board.
And the conforming or non-conforming means whether or not it was built prior to regulatory process or built to a past regulatory process.
And we liberalize that to the extent state law permits.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, this is just how you want to contextualize that. We thought it would be helpful to have a paragraph that just says, this is what this means. It's not saying you're in a legal structure. It's just, here's what it means. So it's a preamble to all the rules that govern those structures.
I got it.
Okay. So let's go ahead and vote on these items, and then we'll take a 5-minute break.
Great.
Okay, so item 24, thumbs up or thumbs down? Thumbs up. Okay, item 25, go ahead.
Number 25 was the use of the letter E for projects. Number 26, the dredge disposal piece.
I don't know about that.
And I can certainly come back or offline give you more information about how dredging works in the SMP because it's related but separate issue. I'm happy to connect you with that information. And then number 38, context for the non-conforming. Okay, great.
Thank you. It's 10:18. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break and we'll be back. Okay, we are back from break. It is 10:34 a.m. and we are picking back up with page number 8 with the 3 decision items left on the BoCC decision matrix.
Thank you. Lost the PowerPoint there. Okay, so the last slide of these particular items, item 48 is actually related to item 22 and potentially could have grouped those. So this is requiring pervious surface for the viewing platforms and decks. So we had talked previously about when you can allow a deck or a platform inside the buffer. The previous draft didn't specifically require that those would need to be made out of pervious surface to let the water get through. This was recommended by Ecology as part of mitigation sequencing, similar to that piece about ensuring that the deck is the smallest necessary and to support the use. So the board's public hearing draft requires these structures to be pervious, which can include a typical wooden deck that you would think to install. It just has to be designed that the water gets through and the ground isn't compacted below.
So a gap between the board.
Exactly, yeah. So versus, concrete slab, right?
Okay.
So we got 2 public comments on this, one that expressed support for prohibiting impervious surfaces near the shoreline, and one that was concerned that the word pervious may be confusing. But I would point out that it is defined in the SMP, and that definition includes that allowance for wooden decks to be considered pervious if they're constructed the right way. So that's that item. Item 59 is permit standards for shoreline stabilization in the aquatic SED. So this has to do with permit requirements for shoreline stabilization that happens below the ordinary high water mark. The previous draft had a couple of blanks in the table and used footnotes to explain what the permitting was. Ecology recommends using the actual permit standards in the table itself. So we clarified the document to state that hard stabilization, such as a bulkhead, is mostly prohibited below the ordinary high water mark. And if you are going to allow it in limited circumstances, it would require a conditional use permit. And then other types of stabilization would require substantial development permit unless they're exempt under the provisions of state law. So I don't think that actually changed the requirement in the draft. I think those were the requirements that would have happened by default, but this puts them in the table and actually assigns letters to them so it's easier for people to read that table. We got 1 public comment on that, which was just expressed opposition to having the hearings examiner need to review a conditional use permit, which is the standard. Conditional use permits go to the hearings examiner. Item number 67 is the last one we have, which is the use of non-native vegetation in replanting requirements. So this pertains to the use of non-native vegetation if you're required to do replanting as part of a permitted project, like mitigation. The previous draft made some allowances to use non-native vegetation on a mitigation project and asked Ecology, specifically the Planning Commission asked Ecology for feedback or some sideboards on that and when that might be appropriate. So they indicated that the use of non-native vegetation is consistent with the statute. It does have a time and place. So the board public hearing draft includes Ecology's recommendations, which are to limit the use of non-native vegetation to those instances where what you're impacting is grass, lawn, or some sort of non-native. If that vegetation that you're using is replacing the same function. So the draft does not allow non-native vegetation to be used to compensate for the removal of native vegetation. The draft also does not allow the use of invasive, exotic, or noxious plants at all. And I think that is providing additional flexibility versus the previous draft of the SMP to use non-native vegetation in limited instances where it may be appropriate. And that, I'll pause there. Oh, and 3 public comments, all of which discouraged that.
Commissioner Mentor, go ahead.
I think I'm okay with that piece, but can you give an example of like what, I mean, I don't know on the ground how this plays out. Like what is the concern? Like if you had to use native vegetation, how is that a problem for folks? Sometimes you can't, it's too expensive or it doesn't plant.
It's sourcing.
Sourcing.
Is what the planning commission.
And it
yeah,
delays
you
your
can't get it.
project or something?
There are concerns about, the ability to get it. Is it timing, season, location. One of the pieces that we have identified in that, all those educational materials we're gonna put together is a guide to finding native vegetation locally. And I know some of the other jurisdictions have those pieces. So like City of Lacey, I think, has that, for example. So we wanna help people find that and make the decision to use native vegetation wherever they can. But yeah, that was the concern that has been expressed by Planning Commission, and I think some members of the public as well. So,
Okay, thank you.
Oh, go ahead if you had a question.
No, I was just gonna wonder, right? It's been interesting, as people will plant, with the mitigation planting and kind of the line of questioning, I'm wondering about when people plant, usually it's aesthetic purposes, and sometimes they don't know the after effects of maybe there's, when I went a while back on Long Lake, there were several areas where people had these planted, these beautiful plants, and one of the things that they were explaining to me is like, actually this plant, it's like so invasive that, one pod flies and it lands in the water, and then it creates all these issues with weeds. And so I'm just wondering, like, does it have anything to do with like maybe just sticking plants instead, or I don't know, I was just curiosity more.
so if someone's required to do replanting, they're gonna be submitting a mitigation report that outlines what they're proposing to do, what species they're proposing to use. Be able to check that and make sure that there's nothing on there that's considered to be invasive or exotic or, nuisance or anything like that. So you wouldn't be permitting that type of vegetation to be used. But there's some middle ground between invasive and native, where you have non-native plants. They're not from here, but they don't pose a problem to be used, and they may provide similar function to whatever it is you're replacing. And in those instances, what he has said is, that may be appropriate to use the non-native. So that's what the draft as drafted would do.
On item 59, what is the water level you're referring to? You said something about below the water line. Is that below the water line, say in the summer, you're down, but in the winter, you're up? So could you define that a little better?
Yep, it's the ordinary high water mark, which is all shoreline jurisdiction is based on. If you're below it, you're aquatic. If you're above it, you're in one of those, natural or urban conservancy. It's essentially the line on the shoreline where you can go out and look and say, this is typically where the high water mark would be. This is the normal extent of the high water. It doesn't account for, so it would be below the king tides on Puget Sound. We know the water goes higher than that point, but on average, it's back here. I think on lakes it's a little more consistent potentially, but streams and marine shorelines obviously have tides. But it takes someone going out there and looking, where is that line? Because that's the line that your buffers are measured from, and all those types of things.
So how does that work with bulkheads that are already in place? Been there for years, but they were put in probably during the low water time of the year, and then they're underwater during that high time of the year. Is there an effect there? Talks about hard stabilization, and I guess that would be hard stabilization if it was concrete. I don't know is it hard stabilization if it's made out of wood?
I think we're usually thinking of things like concrete. It would be considered harder structure, but it's not as permanent and hard as, say, a bulkhead or something like that. But you're probably thinking of like wooden wall versus placement of logs and things like that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out the difference, but I do know of some places where there are concrete bulkhead, I don't know, bases, I guess, that had to have been poured during, the summer months or fall. And I'm just trying to figure out how that affects those folks.
I would say that generally speaking, the draft would allow you to replace a structure. If you demonstrate that you need the same thing in the same place, the draft allows you to do that. If the ordinary high water mark has moved, potentially you would move that structure. But I think you can still replace below the ordinary high. And I may not be able to figure it out on the fly here, but the draft at least speaks to if you need to build a new one below the ordinary high water mark, it's either, if it's not prohibited, it would be probably something that would be allowed through a variance, I think. Well, we did talk about that actually.
One of the earlier ones we talked about this morning had something to do with that.
Right. Table here. But yeah, so you can replace, I believe, generally speaking, there's some documentation that needs to happen, but conceptually it is allowed.
And that doesn't change that. It's still,
Right. Yeah, we're essentially clarifying what was already in the draft. It's putting those standards back in the table. So we already had a footnote that said, hard stabilization is prohibited in the aquatic unless demonstrated necessary and that can be permitted with a conditional use permit. That was already in the draft. We're just basically putting that in words up here or letters. So marking the table is prohibited with that footnote so that.
I guess what I'm wondering about is something that was constructed prior, before, I don't know.
Yeah.
But years ago.
Yeah.
So that doesn't affect that situation, nothing in there.
I think we'd allow the replacement. Like if you look down at the standards for shoreline stabilization, it talks about placing, the same structure in the same place for the same purpose. If there's a demonstrated need, the draft does allow that.
Okay.
So 38, 59, and 67. Any additional questions or comments on any of them? Not, I'm going to move forward with a vote. 48,
Okay, 3 thumbs up,
59,
3 thumbs up,
and 67.
and 3 thumbs up. Okay, thank you. Great. Very exciting. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so the last item substantive item I've got teed up for you today is related to public comments that were received by Alex Nielsen and his representatives. Alex's family owns the Holroyd gravel mine in the Nisqually Valley. They made some comments on how the draft incorporates what's known as the flood of record into the Shoreline Master Program. Currently, as you know, the draft SMP brings several critical areas that are in the vicinity of shorelines into shoreline jurisdiction. This includes what's known as the flood of record elevation, which is essentially the highest known flood elevation from what we have on hand in our data. And that goes beyond, the FEMA 100-year floodplain in many areas. So to be clear, this area is already regulated by the Critical Areas Ordinance and by Title 14, Chapter 1438, our flood chapter. The intent in bringing these areas into shoreline jurisdiction is to ensure that there's one permitting system for properties that contain both shorelines and critical areas, or so that we don't have a patchwork where some frequently flooded areas are covered by one program, some are covered by another, or some are covered by two. So the comments received express concern on the amount of area that is coming into shoreline jurisdiction, especially in areas that are further from the shoreline. So there's 2 examples here on the right side of the page. The top one is the Nisqually Valley and actually shows the portion of the property we received public comments on. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but this whole triangle area
Move your cursor around.
right there, yeah, the triangle here. It's kind of the area that specifically got comments.
see it.
Oh, I can point it out on here. So this area right here, that was the subject of the specific public comments. And so what this shows you, the area that's in blue cross-hatching is the 100-year floodplain, and which is also proposed to be brought into shoreline jurisdiction. The teal areas are the flood of record that extend beyond the floodplain. On the bottom, there's another example of showing Scatter Creek, where you can see the difference between the floodplain in blue and the flood of record, which is more of that teal and is a larger area.
When you say teal versus,
You might want to point out, it's really
Yeah,
hard to see
okay.
the color
I
distinction.
can't hardly tell what you're referring to.
So
here.
this whole area is blue, but you can see there's these pockets
Okay,
of teal there in the railroad corridor. And then here, this central area is blue, but on either side, you can see it's wider and is teal. And up in this area is.
and where's
white.
that located at?
At Scatter Creek. I just did two examples. We only got comments on the top one, but I wanted to kind of show two different examples of how this plays out in the county, because the Chehalis Basin is another area where the flood of record is quite a lot bigger than the floodplain. So, as I mentioned, including the flood of record elevation does go beyond the minimum state requirements that we're required to regulate in our SMP. Again, the goal in doing so is to provide a single regulatory layer to all these frequently flooded areas versus having two permit systems in play. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, were these areas included beforehand? And if they were not, like, why now?
So they were included in the board's public hearing draft. I think they were included in the planning commission draft. This goes back to earlier phases of the project. The intent was to, streamline so that there's one program and permit system that applies to all of these areas. They are regulated today. It's just that they're regulated by the critical areas ordinance. So the flood record, critical areas.
So you're saying if you're in the teal, you're still subject to something, I don't know exactly what.
Right.
But it would be under critical areas ordinance, not this shoreline.
Yeah. So yeah, the one of the messages here is that, anything that you see colored on that map, any of that teal and blue area is all subject to flooding and therefore subject to regulation. So if the shoreline master program didn't regulate those areas, they'd still be, people would still be protected. We would not allow them to put new structures in those areas. The real question here is, do we want those to be part of shoreline jurisdiction or not? Based on the comment and board's response to that comment, you've asked for that opportunity to take a look at that.
And then I think you go over a
do.
couple of those
I
considerations.
do, yes,
so go
thank
ahead.
you. So now that we've kind of talked about that a little bit, as I mentioned, the board has a decision point, frankly, to proceed with SMP jurisdiction as is currently drafted, or the board could consider removing flood record elevation from shoreline jurisdiction. There's probably other options I could come up with. But yeah, I put some considerations up here from the briefing. Some things that I'd, again, point out that regardless of the board's decision, these areas are still going to be development in those areas will continue to be regulated by county codes. This is also an area I expect that ecology is going to comment on. They've asked some of the same questions that the public has about, the extent of shoreline jurisdiction and how far out from the shoreline water body it goes. And I'd also note on the flip side of including these areas is the considerations that the larger the shoreline jurisdiction, the larger the area that the county has to demonstrate no net loss, the larger the area that potentially ecology has decision-making authority on county permits. So that's kind of the whole gist of it. There was rationale for including those areas, but there are potential drawbacks as well, so.
Okay, so right off the bat, I would be, I guess, from a general perspective, I would be opposed to the ecology having more authority over the citizenry. So are you saying if I voted for this, I'm voting against that philosophy then, I guess? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so any area that we call part of shoreline jurisdiction, anyone who needs a variance or a conditional use permit in those areas, those permits are subject to ecology approval. We are not the final decision-making authority on that, we county. So yeah, if it's a bigger area, that's potentially more properties and more projects over the lifetime of this program that would require ecology to approve that.
What is the mapping, maybe could you go back to
Yeah,
the
sure.
two examples? I mean, when we're talking about increasing distance from the actual shoreline, what are we talking about here? Like
So-
where's,
I think this is probably the best example. This is where it would currently end, right, Andy?
Mhm.
And then if you include flood of record, it would include,
and where's the shoreline itself?
I think that Scatter Creek runs through that, so the stream itself comes
It's
through
dry
it,
a lot of the
close to
year.
it, or it might actually be on the left
Well,
side.
show me the Nisqually Valley example. Where's the shoreline? Where would be the actual?
The Nisqually
I mean, I
River.
see a river up in the upper left corner, right?
The Nisqually River is roughly a mile in that direction, I think. It's pretty far away. But I would point out that, there's a similar question for floodplain, because even if the flood of record goes away, the floodplain still covers a significant amount of area and is still farther away from the water.
And that's, so that's supposed to be, the floodplain is supposed to be within shoreline jurisdiction, but we're just questioning whether or not flood of record should be?
The minimum that we're required to put in, I believe, it's the bare minimum. If you've got the Nisqually River, which is a shoreline water body, the bare minimum would be the floodway, and then 200 feet landward, 200 feet of the floodplain landward. Jurisdictions also, and the ecology spells out, you have the option to bring in your whole floodplain if you choose to. The county went to the extreme of, maybe not extreme, but depends on who you are. We went the extra step of including all frequently flooded areas that we regulate. The county regulates to the flood of record. I don't know that all jurisdictions do that. That's part of the reason why we're
Community rating,
number 2 on the
flood rating?
CRS, right. So our critical areas ordinance is fairly, protective of these frequently flooded areas. The shoreline master program is mirroring that for the sake of implementation, but that is optional. We do not
And expanding that.
But you're
And expanding it.
expand current jurisdiction. As drafted, yes, it would expand jurisdiction.
And you're saying that even ecology is questioning whether or not we should be going to that extent?
Yeah, so we're doing it under the banner of the critical areas piece and, associated critical areas coming in. But I think they're saying, well, yes, but your associated critical area goes a mile from the river. Does that make sense? And so I think we're going to see comments on that. I don't know which way that will fall. I haven't been given an indication that they would essentially block it, but I think there's going to be comments, and it's not the last we've heard on it. So,
Block us,
well, not block, but, say back.
including it?
Right. Yeah, I haven't heard that they're going to do that, but I think it's definitely going to come up. So,
I mean, from what I understood Commissioner Edwards to say, you'd rather not have it in there
Well, I don't.
because of ecology's ability to then.
Yeah, I am in the middle of it if I can help it. That's where I'm at.
Well, it sounds like they may not want to be in the middle of it.
and to be
In
clear,
which case, I would just say, let's just keep it with the floodplain.
yeah, and so that's going to alleviate some concern from some folks, but it's not necessarily going to take it all out because the floodplain is still,
It's wide, but I also don't want to
Right.
compromise our flood rating, community flood rating, which is like something that we're.
it wouldn't, because all of the existing regulations for those floodplains and flood of record will still be on the books. Not having it part of the shoreline management program.
yeah, it'll
will
just be
not
subject to the TAO.
So you're really asking us two things? You're asking us whether we want to knock out the teal or knock out the blue and the teal?
I'm not, no, the only question based on public comment was the teal and the flood of record. I'm just pointing out that the floodplains are also wide, but, the flood of record is more area. I just wanted to be transparent because the comments were concerned about the application of the SMP to that specific group of properties. They're still going to be subject to it because the floodplain is part of shoreline jurisdiction.
So the decision point is whether to include the flood of record within shoreline jurisdiction.
I don't want to make it more
Yeah,
restrictive.
it's gonna be a no for me.
That's my issue. My whole issue is I don't want to make things more restrictive. And I kind of want the citizens to make some decision. If they want to put a house there and it gets flooded and they can't get flood insurance and all that, well, that's up to them, kind of. I don't think government ought to raise them from the cradle to the grave, so.
If there are already sort of those safeguards in place,
right.
Relative, I just think it potentially adds a layer of confusion between already trying to understand what is a CAO, what is the SMP. The more you kind of get if those overlapped, it's much harder, I think, to do that educational piece of what is.
Well, it makes more sense when they actually overlap, you know, like within the shorelines.
Well, in a lot of places they do. The flood of record layer underlies the entire floodplain. So it's bigger
That's
than,
about as clear as
they already overlap.
Well, they underlap, but I mean, I'm talking about the shoreline jurisdiction itself.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a property owner over here in the floodplain, you might not think to look at the shoreline map program. It's
Right,
like-
that's what I'm saying. I mean, yeah, okay, well,
So to clarify, so the question of flood record, does the board have an option to revisit the floodplain being
If they
included?
wanted to, sure.
what's the argument for that?
It's same. It's looking to, you know, how many layers of regulation do you want on a piece of property? I think very close to the river, it makes a lot more, it's a much more, the argument makes more sense, right? That half of my property is covered by one, the other half is covered by another, you know. But that's certainly something I can come back with. We've got another briefing scheduled in the week, kind of conversation.
Could you clarify some of that stuff, this stuff in the 3 weeks? Try and put some simplicity to it. Yes, if you can.
I mean, you're telling me that the actual effect on the ground for the property owner is the same, because they're subject to critical areas ordinance, they're subject to critical areas regulation that's folded into the SMP, is that right?
Yeah, I think, so specific concern with the SMP is that it's another layer of semi-zoning, right? Because this comes with, okay, you're in the flood of record, great, now what's your designation? And that designation carries restrictions on land use in a way that which is different from critical area ordinance does, similar, different. Well, yeah, more restrictions, and then also, again, it's that ecology piece, right? It's another agency potentially having decision authority. I think those are the kinds of concerns that people have of that shoreline jurisdiction expanding.
It is the only argument for including it all that it's just easier to administer or
Implement,
something?
yeah, that's the main one. Yeah,
That's the why. Even
So I think if you're located closer to the river, it is going to introduce some complexity if we don't include the floodplain, because they may have to get both the critical areas permit still, as well as a permit under the SMA. For someone who's further away, you know, outside that 200 foot, it's going to be as it is today. They would just have to get a critical areas
Right.
permit instead of a shoreline master program permit. So
Well, I don't want them to have to do a shoreline master
It's-
permit or something. Initially, that's my initial take on it. And so why would we want to do that even? How come we want to keep imposing more regulatory stuff on folks? Knowing we don't want to ruin the environment.
I think it's really that expansion relative to the SMP and ecology jurisdiction within that. And just it may make sense from a simplicity standpoint in excellent application or administration, but doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, and if ecology themselves are questioning whether or not we should be doing it, then I'd say let's pull it back to at least to the flood plain.
Mhm.
There's no reason.
I
to go
just
to
like to hear a little more about it, so I can be, so when I get asked by a citizen about that or the other, I have an answer that I don't know, or I don't understand.
I could certainly bring that back at the next briefing.
did we also, that there was also,
17.
revisiting whether buffer averaging is an item of discussion that the board wants to take up.
Are you going to walk through what the next items are?
So this is essentially the end of the substantive items being reviewed. So this is a question of additional items from your review plans that you wanted. Otherwise, what I have on my list is to check back in with you about shoreline buffers in general. I can give you an update on the SED conversation on one of the properties. We've got item number 17, and this flood piece. That's the only piece that I have on my list pending anything you would like to cover.
Okay.
Is there anything else?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay.
We never talked about aquaculture stuff,
Mhm.
and I want to hear what other jurisdictions have done there and what the concern, I want an overview of that. I have some ideas maybe of how to handle that, without trying to reinvent the wheel, but there's so much public comment related to that, I think we have to go through it. So,
That's something the other
Yeah,
board. Okay.
that's fine. Okay, so then the next follow-up briefing will be on November 20th, is what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
And you will be going through the items that have just been listed. And hopefully, that's the last one. If not, then we need to be discussing about,
Saturdays.
I would just say, anything, so all the documents are going to be due to the board office by, I think, Friday, December 7th. So really, the 20th is probably the last opportunity to provide feedback to me to turn it around in time if the intent is to finish it this year.
Okay,
We have another 2 hours that day.
perfect.
Okay?
Can we not do a half a day? Is there not availability? I just want to make sure that we have the time to be able to push through whatever we need.
You get 3 hours if you all start at 8 in the morning. There is an agenda review for the meeting the following day on the 21st at 11, just like our similar schedule is today.
However, we can move that to the afternoon and devote more time in the morning
I think it's
to
worth it,
the shoreline master.
Yeah,
because we're close, but there
Yeah.
are a couple of, items, and we're so close, it'd be a shame not to get this to the
So let us
finish line.
take a look and see what we can do to lengthen the time that day.
yep. I'm really, I can move anything around. The only